Welcome to the Indigenous Navigators Survey module on climate change and Indigenous peoples' rights. Climate change is threatening the enjoyment of a range of human rights for Indigenous peoples, including their rights to land, territories and resources, culture, life, health, and an adequate standard of living. Human rights bodies have already established that states have a human rights obligation to prevent foreseeable negative human rights harms of climate change, and to use their maximum available resources to address these effects, particularly for those in the most vulnerable situations. See, for example, these excerpts from a joint statement from a number of human rights treaty bodies. Failure to take measures to prevent foreseeable harm to human rights caused by climate change, or to regulate activities contributing to such harm, could constitute a violation of states' human rights obligations. When reducing emissions and adapting to climate impacts, states must seek to address all forms of discrimination and inequality, including advancing substantive gender equality, protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and of persons with disabilities, and taking into consideration the best interests of the child. As part of international assistance and cooperation towards the realization of human rights, high-income states should support adaptation and mitigation efforts in developing countries by facilitating transfers of green technology and by contributing to financing climate mitigation and adaptation. Climate instruments have underlined the need for respecting human rights and Indigenous peoples' rights when designing climate policies, plans, and programs. The Paris Agreement outlines, acknowledging that climate change is a common concern of humankind, parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, the rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity. To promote more human rights-based implementation of these climate agreements, we must not only know the human rights to which we are entitled, but also the binding obligations made by states in these climate agreements to address climate change. Failure to implement these obligations in these climate agreements often leads to violations of human rights, including for Indigenous peoples. In addition, several environmental instruments provide important guidance, for example, on how the right to participation and the right to access of information should be interpreted in environmental matters. In this video, we therefore provide you with an overview of the key international climate change and environmental instruments and key climate change related national laws and policies and mechanisms to be reviewed when assessing the consequences of these climate commitments for human rights. The survey module on climate change and Indigenous rights often uses the standards and obligations set out in key instruments on climate change. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement are the main instruments of the international climate change regime that set out the obligations of states. The UNFCCC is an international treaty that today has near universal membership. It is an agreement to combat climate change, mainly through the limitation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Importantly, it places the responsibility on industrialized countries to lead the way in cutting emissions within their state. The Paris Agreement, also referred to as the Paris Accords or Paris Climate Accords, is an international treaty on climate change that falls under the UNFCCC. This is an international treaty which covers obligations regarding climate change mitigation, adaptation, and finance. In addition to these climate instruments, there are environmental instruments that focus on procedural rights, including access to information, public participation, and access to justice. These environmental instruments also apply in the context of climate change. While known as the Aarhus Convention, This is the UN Economic Commission for Europe's Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters. The Convention enforces obligations on ratifying parties and the European Union. The agreement grants rights regarding access to information, public participation, and access to justice in matters concerning the local, national, and transboundary environment. While known as the Escazú Agreement, this refers to the regional agreement on access to information, public participation, and justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. It places obligations on parties from Latin American and Caribbean nations concerning the rights of access to information about the environment, public participation in environmental decision-making, environmental justice, and a healthy and sustainable environment for current and future generations. It also includes provisions addressing the rights of environmental human rights defenders, or human rights defenders in environmental matters. Another important environmental instrument in the context of climate change is the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. This is a multilateral treaty focused on biological diversity. The Convention's three main goals are the conservation of biological diversity, or biodiversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the commercial and other utilization of genetic resources. Biodiversity enhances the resilience of ecosystems. This assists in their adaptation to changing climate conditions. Diverse ecosystems are better able to withstand and recover from extreme weather events and other climate impacts. Although not specifically climate change and environmental instruments, the following frameworks also include important state commitments relevant for climate change. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction provides guidance to states on preventing new and reducing existing disaster risk. It aims to do so through 7 clear targets, which include understanding disaster risk, strengthening disaster risk governance, investing in disaster risk reduction and resilience, and enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response. Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, of Agenda 2030 include many SDGs of relevance to climate change. For example, SDG 1, to end poverty in all its forms, looks at building resilience against climate change-related hazards. SDG 13, to take action to combat climate change, also looks at building resilience and the ability to adapt to climate-related hazards and natural disasters. Some of the questions within the surveys align with the issues covered by a specific SDG. These questions are therefore structured in a way that allows for information to be pulled from existing data collection processes for SDG monitoring, or for the responses to contribute to SDG monitoring. Climate change-related laws and policies. The surveys ask for human rights-based assessments of climate change-related laws and policies. These typically include the following: Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, National Climate Change Policies, Laws and Acts, National Adaptation Plans or similar, Disaster Risk Reduction Policies, Green Energy Transition Policies, and other policies which specifically address climate change. Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, are voluntary commitments from states that reflect their efforts to meet the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, to reduce national emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. The Paris Agreement requires each party to prepare, communicate, and maintain successive NDCs that it intends to achieve. These NDCs are submitted by Paris Agreement parties every 5 years, showing progression and reflecting the highest possible ambition. These NDCs are collected online by the UNFCCC in the NDC Registry. National Climate Change Policies, Laws and Acts refers to any judicial or structural commitments that a country has made specific to climate change. Climate change legislation and policy is a rapidly changing and growing area. Examples may include Austria's Climate Change Protection Act of 2011 and Uganda and Fiji's Climate Change Acts of 2021. The National Adaptation Plan, or NAP process, was established under the Cancun Adaptation Framework. It established a means for countries to develop and implement NAPs as a way to identify adaptation needs, develop and then implement strategies and programs to address these needs. NAPs are collected online by the UNFCCC Secretariat on the NAP Central website. In the surveys, this category also includes instances where countries don't have national adaptation plans but may have other policies that address climate adaptation. Disaster risk reduction policies include any policies that a country may have developed that aim to anticipate, prevent, and reduce disaster risk or emergency situations, and implement actions for preparedness, response, and recovery. Green energy transition policies are strategies and measures implemented by governments to shift towards environmentally sustainable and low-carbon economies. For example, the shift towards renewable sources of energy such as solar, wind, and hydropower, and away from fossil fuels. Examples may include Morocco's Natural Gas Roadmap, launched in 2021, and Nigeria's Energy Transition Plan, launched in 2022. This category also includes policies that aim to address potential impacts of this transition. For example, policies about training and employment for workers from fossil fuel industries who will be most affected by the transition. This category, on other policies which specifically address climate change, should include policies that are specifically motivated by climate change concerns, however do not fit into the other categories. For example, it could include REDD+ policies, which look at reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, policies on carbon sequestration, climate-smart agriculture policies, green transportation policies, or similar.